Today is May 15th, 2025. There is no guest today. This is a monologue. As far as I know, this is the 1000th episode of EconTalk. And to mark that occasion, I thought I'd share some thoughts. It's a little self-indulgent. I'm going to talk about some of the logistics and nuts and bolts of the podcast, which people have asked me about over the years. And I'm going to reflect on what this has been like to do this for almost 20 years, 1,000 times. So to do that, I started to do this. I made an outline of what I was going to talk about and then realized I wasn't excited about doing it. And I went home and told my wife that it had just kind of fell flat. Just couldn't get any enthusiasm for the idea. And she said, we should have had Chat GPT ask you the questions. And I thought, well, that's a good idea. So I did that. And so this, I will occasionally repeat some of its questions or just answer them because that'll make sense. But that was a fascinating experience in and of itself. And I may reflect on that along the way as we get started. So the first question, I love the way that it asked this question. This is the O3, by the way, of Chat GPT, which is really an extraordinary achievement. I've done, I think, 20 episodes on AI, interviewing people about it, its threats, its potential, how it works. And I do think O3 is a quantum leap in improvement, and that may be, we'll talk about that maybe at another time. But here's the wording of the first question. What was the spark that convinced you to hit record? And what were your earliest ambitions for the show? And it had said before, when you launched EconTalk back in 2006, podcasting was still a fringe medium, and long-form economics conversations sounded, frankly, like a gamble. So what was the spark? Well, I was late to blogging. I started Cafe Hayek with Don Boudreau, and it just had a long run under Don's leadership. In the early days, I blogged alongside him, and I felt we had come late to blogging, and whenever we started at 2004, whenever it was. And so I didn't want to be late to podcasting once I discovered it. And the way I discovered it was, as far as I know, James Reese, an economist, interviewed me on his podcast, Radio Economics. I don't think it exists anymore. Jim, if you're out there, say hello. Or if anybody knows about this, can remember this better than I can. But he called me up and interviewed me about, which is how we did interviews in those days, on the phone. He called me up and asked me to talk about Walmart. And at the end, or maybe it was beforehand, I said, how many people listen to this? I mean, I've never heard of podcasts. He said, well, it's 2,000 to 3,000. And when I heard that, I thought, wow, if I could show up on Monday mornings and there were 3,000 people sitting in an auditorium with two chairs at the front of the room, and I could go sit in one of them and a guest could be in the other one, I think I'd come to that room and it would be fun to have 3,000 listeners. Now, at the time, I thought, well, and the other reason I was interested was that I wanted to do I had considered for a while doing a radio show, a talk radio show, an interview program. And I had done a lot of commentary at that point, I think, for NPR. And I thought maybe someday I could get an NPR talk show. Maybe. And maybe I was interested. I didn't know if I could really want to do it. It seemed like a lot of work. But this seemed like a way to try it and do like a free trial to do podcasting and see if anybody listened and how hard was it. So in the early days, I think I started off just doing them occasionally. You can look at the archive. But shortly after that, after starting, I realized that people expected to hear one on some kind of regular basis, because otherwise they'd show up and it would be the same episode as was up there before, and we wouldn't be making any progress. So I was pretty early on, I decided I would do one every week. And I kept to that schedule. I would take off the last week or two of the year for the holiday season, give myself a break. And then I realized, well, people like it every week, so I think I'll just record one in advance. I can take off the holidays anyway. And so it turns out, according to AI, I forget which one I looked at, I think it was Chat GPT, I have put out an episode of EconTalk for 854 consecutive Mondays. This will be 855 if all goes well, or maybe it's a little more than that, actually, because it didn't know about the couple that are coming up. But December 2008 was the last time I missed a Monday. So the first Monday of 2009, for the last 16 years, I have done one of these. It's hard. I have a job now that's pretty demanding. I had a job before, but EconTalk was a non-trivial part of it. So the chance to do this every week has been a lot. The privilege of doing it every week has gotten a lot harder now that I'm president of Shalom College in Jerusalem. But I'm kind of addicted to it, and I like to think some of you are as well. So we haven't missed a Monday in a long time. I worried during the war that we might miss the war here since October 7th. I might miss one. We've managed to not do that. We've managed to keep them going. I will have a health issue, inevitably, probably, someday while this program is still in my hands, and that's exciting. It is still in my hands, but someday we'll have a challenge, and we'll maybe use an old episode to keep the streak going. But for now, we've kept it going for 850 plus Mondays, which is kind of cool. The next question was, how did I think of this 3,000 person interview audience? Was it going to be a lecture or a radio call-in, a fireside chat, or something else? And it's funny, when I started the program, for some reason, I kind of thought it should be about an hour. I don't know why I thought that, but I soon found out that sometimes it's hard to keep it to an hour, but I tried to in the early days. I remember my dad saying, "Oh, an hour? No one's going to listen for an hour." I mean, it's 2006. He said, radio pieces are like NPR is 8 minutes. That's long. No one will listen for an hour. I didn't care. The other thing that was fun in the early days is that people said, well, you'll run out of guests because how many economists can you interview? Of course, I found out that quickly that there were people who weren't economists who were fun to talk to. And I had this brilliant idea that you could interview somebody more than once. Sometimes they had more than 1 hour's worth of interesting information. So obviously the program has changed a lot since the early days when it was pretty much all economists all the time. But I now am happy to go over an hour. And of course, since I started the podcast, there are podcasts that go for 3 and 4 hours. I've been a guest on some of those. I say, how long are we going to go for? Oh, 3 or 4 hours. I think I can't stand to listen to myself for barely more than an hour. I can't do that. So I've done a few longish ones. But on EconTalk, I think the longest episode we ever did was Davies on extreme economies, I think it's called. We'll put a link up to it. It's Richard Davies. And that was 2 hours and 4 minutes. The Haviv Reddick Gore episode is about that long. It's 2 hours and 4 minutes, maybe a few seconds shorter than the Davies one, but they're both in the 2 hour and 4 minute length. That's a little long. But the goal now is I try to go a little over an hour. And if it's still interesting, I go 1 hour and 15 or an hour and 20. In the early days, the audience I had in mind were people interested in economics. And I was always thinking, how do I reach people who are interested in economics? Should I advertise in like The Economist or the Wall Street Journal? Of course, we never advertised anywhere in that normal way. But that's who I saw as my core audience. And in the back of my mind, I thought I was going to encourage people to understand free market principles better. So early episodes, especially with people that I didn't agree with, were more or less a debate. And if you go back to the early episodes, there's two things that bother me about them. One is that debate mindset, and the other is I talk too much. So if you go back to the beginning, as many people have, which blows me away, there are many people who tell me they started at the beginning or they've gone back to the beginning and they've listened to every single episode, some of them more than once. But if you do that, don't be discouraged. They do get better. But I got interested, two things. One is I realized pretty quickly that my audience wasn't people interested in economics. It was people interested in learning something, which is why eventually we added the tagline, Conversations for the Curious. It was for curious people. People were looking for educational content that was somewhat, a little bit entertaining. And that was my audience. That is my audience now. And it's a crazy thing. You know, you're doing the dishes right now, or you're walking your dog, or you're working out at the gym, and you want to grow or learn or have a interesting something to listen to. And those are the people I think are my main audience, which is, hello out there. It's nice to have you. So that's the story there. The next question, actually, at this point, it's kind of interesting. Just an AI aside, as I mentioned, I think the beginning of EconTalk was when I was interviewed by James Reese, on the show Radio Economics. In the new version of 03, if you watch while it's thinking, you can see its thoughts, whatever that means. You can see what it's looking for and what it's trying to discover. It kept coming back to that question of what was the first podcast I was on that got me interested in EconTalk. It didn't let it put it down. It couldn't put it down. 2 or 3 or 4 different times, that was what it started looking at when I asked it to continue and ask me another question. It was very obsessed with that. But and also it refused to do what I asked it to do, which was to have a conversation back and forth. So at this point, after I answered the question I just did, it then gave me a bunch of questions. How much the mix of entertainment versus education, engineering or re-engineering the prep for when I wasn't doing as much debate. How do I get chemistry to work across the screen now that we're doing it on Zoom? Broadening the virtual hall. How did I get more downloads and people? And we now probably have something over, by the way, it was something like 150,000 listeners. It's hard to define. Any one month has different numbers. And my actual total numbers of downloads are down for, I think, 2 reasons. One, there are people who got angry that I did a bunch of episodes on Israel, and maybe we'll talk about that. And also, Apple stopped automatically downloading episodes to people who, once they subscribe, they don't get every episode that comes out anymore. Now you have, if you don't listen to any of the episodes that have been downloaded, if you don't listen for a while, it stops automatically downloading. So that hurt my numbers. Of course, the numbers were there. That shows the numbers were somewhat distorted. Anyway, our listenership is, something over 100,000, maybe 150. Anyway, so I to continue, the question is, why did I stop doing the debate? And a couple of reasons. I realized that if I yelled at people and debated them and challenged them constantly, people who disagreed with me wouldn't be as interested in coming on the program. And that would mean I'd end up preaching to the choir. And I wasn't interested in that. And I also came to believe, maybe just convincing myself because I'm biased, that debate isn't as good as a shared exploration. That's more like a conversation for discovering truth. If you rant and counter-rant, you're going to get eyeballs and downloads and hits. But I didn't think that would be good for my soul. I thought that'd be bad for me. And I also realized a gentler approach was just more pleasant. I trusted my listeners. I didn't think you had to hear every counter argument. People would say, how could you let so-and-so get away with saying that? Why didn't you answer them? Why? And I thought, well, that's your job. Your job out there is to, when you hear something you think is a bad argument, to take note. So, and I also would say to people who complained about that, if I answered everything I disagreed with and tried to refute it, we wouldn't get too many observations in the course of the talk, of the interview. It would just kind of stagnate. So the bottom line is I tried to build what I would call respectful skepticism with people I didn't agree with. But I saw my mission when I'm interviewing an author about a book they've written, to let them make the case for the book, to try to bring out the narrative arc of the book, or at least the parts that I thought were interesting or that I thought the listeners would find interesting. Now, I still challenge lots of things. I still, raise questions about something an author would claim. But in general, I do not keep going back and forth and argue with them. So it's not an argument. I challenge respectfully. That's sort of the way I think about it. There are exceptions, even in the later years. Some people say things that are so shocking to me, I feel like I can't stay quiet. But in general, I try to let them have their say. I make it clear when appropriate that I do not agree and why. And then you, the listener, can make the decision of which one makes sense to you. My prep hasn't changed much in a long time. I script about 15 questions. Maybe 12, maybe 18. I sometimes will have quotes from the book that I want to use as question generators, or that I might read out loud to let you, the listener, try to understand what the book's about. But I script about 15 questions that I know will get us enough material for the hour or hour plus. Of course, I don't just go down the list. We digress. We go off into side tangents. And a lot of what is challenging about being the host, which it wasn't clear to me until I actually had to do it, is you're doing a bunch of things at once. It's very hard to listen because you're looking at the clock. You're trying to figure out how much time you have left, how much questions you have left. Should you ask a follow-up question? Should you switch gears? Should you challenge? And so it's funny, many of you probably have a better idea of what I said or what the guest said than I do, because my attention is always being pulled in those different directions. And every once in a while, without naming names, I'll get a guest who's not very chatty or not very conversational or very taciturn in general or shy. And I realized early on that I'm in trouble. 15 or 20 questions are not going to be enough to fill the time. And you'll hear me, even in later years, talk more than I might normally do in those situations. So if you notice that, that's what's going on there. The next set of questions, again, Chat GPT wanted to ask me a bunch at once. How do I know when to bite my tongue? What about those questions? What about tangents? What about leaving economics and doing other things? A whole bunch of other, there's a bunch more. But here's, I came up with about 14 questions at that point. So I'm going to try to answer some of them. But so when it comes to biting my tongue, that is not responding to something, I don't remember particular moments. Sometimes I hesitate internally. I'm debating whether I should answer or not. What else? Do I share the questions in advance? Never, almost never. I have guests who ask me to, but I always worry that if I do that, it'll sound scripted and less spontaneous. So I will occasionally give them, when they're uneasy or nervous, I'll give them an overview of the topics we're going to talk about, but I don't give them the exact questions. A handful of times I've set the first question to the guest because I want to get off on a good start. I don't want them to be all, rambling and lost when they start. And I should also say that if you go back to the first episodes of the program, I'm often fumbling around trying to get the conversation started. And I realized pretty early on that that's when listeners leave the room. You switch channels, turn it off, go to find something else. So I always script the opening question and read it verbatim. But after that, I often, I'll improvise and go with the flow. What else? Was there a conscious moment when I broadened the focus from economics? I don't think so, but it was gradual. It was pretty clear to me when a couple of things were clear to me at various points. After the financial crisis of 2008, it was pretty clear to me that I had to understand it. And I knew I didn't. I knew almost nothing about finance. So I did, 20, 30 episodes to try to get tooled up on that. And you came along for the ride. You heard those as well. And I figured you wanted to understand it as well as I did. And as a result of that, I wrote a book, Gambling with Other People's Money, trying to understand the incentives that may have contributed to the financial crisis. So that was really a wonderful intellectual journey that I could have done without the different guests that I did, that I interviewed in those days. And then starting around the rise of Trump in the mid-2010s, 2015, 2016, it was also clear to me at that point that that standard economics was not what people cared about at the moment. And I started trying to understand what was going on in America that had led to Trump. And by that, I meant, I've said this many times, I don't think of Trump as much as, until recently, I would say he was much more of an effect rather than a cause. Right now, he's doing some causes. He's causing some things. It's a very different time. We may do a future episode on that, a follow-up to the one I did with Mike Munger on Doge. But the general broadening was a realization that economics, part of it was economics is too narrow to understand what's going on. This isn't just about the economy, stupid. It's about other things. And the other part was that I found economics less interesting. I found economics less able to contribute to my understanding of the world. There were many, many other things I was interested in. And every once in a while, I reflect on the reality that while that is true, that I am a little tired of economics, it's also the case that a little economics goes a very long way in preventing bad reasoning. So even though I sometimes have become more skeptical of economics as a way of thinking, or I've softened my views on what is some of my dogmatism, I'll give an example of that in a few minutes. Even though I've softened my views on that, it really is useful to understand some of the basics. Having said that, I have a joke that I have listeners, I'm sure some of you are still out there, who would love to have an episode on Bitcoin every week, or on monetary economics generally, or some topic that you're passionate about, which I respect. The problem is that I'm sure there are things I don't understand about Bitcoin, quite a few things, but I understand what I want to understand. I've kind of learned what I think I need to learn about Bitcoin. And just like I'd learned what I needed to learn about the financial crisis. I'm sure there are things I don't understand about. I'm sure there are other theories, but many of those theories are just not interesting to me. And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm missing a chance to learn about some incredible theory of the financial crisis or some aspect of Bitcoin that's revolutionary that I'm neglecting. But what I've done in those topics is I've done a bunch of interviews. Same with AI right now. I've done a bunch of interviews on AI. There are more things to learn. There are different perspectives, but I've learned a lot, and I hope you have too, and it's time to move on to other topics. I would say the same thing about Israel. I moved to Israel in 2021. I'm Jewish. You'd think I'd know a lot about the founding of the state and the Arab-Israeli crisis and the war, what became the war in Gaza. But the fact is, I didn't know a lot about it when I moved here. I knew something about it. So a lot of those episodes, and I don't know, we did 14 or so on Jewish history, Israeli history, and I tried to bring in voices from across the spectrum. I struggled to find Palestinian voices. I have some in the archive, but the truth is, some Palestinians said they would be on the program, and then we couldn't ever find a date. I tried a few times. It was clear, for whatever reason, they either didn't want to be on the program or had bigger fish to fry. And most of them just never responded to my emails for whatever reason. There's no point in speculating what the reason is. I want you to know out there that I did try. But even without those voices, I tried to get some variety in perspectives on the Arab-Israeli relationship and on the history of the founding of the state and the post-state problems that Israel's had with its neighbors and October 7th and its aftermath and so on. But a lot of people didn't like that. And listeners, I've lost listeners who were angry I was too pro-Israel, which I'm sorry about that. I am pro-Israel, but I am eager to learn other things. I'm eager to understand the Palestinians' narrative, and I certainly understand that it's complicated, which, of course, is sort of the motto of the show. It's complicated. Are there, Chat GPT asked, are there moments that left me emotionally wrung out? Sure. There were a couple episodes where people yelled at me, insulted me. I mostly kept my cool, I think. I try not to lose my cool, and would often get letters in those days, people saying, how'd you stay calm? And they'll see me in person, and if I give a talk, if I'm giving a talk somewhere publicly and people come see me, they're always often remark how different my persona is on stage, giving my own talk versus as host of EconTalk. And I'll say, wow, you're so passionate or, intense. But on EconTalk, you're so calm. And I always say, well, yeah, when I'm on doing EconTalk, I'm wearing my EconTalk hat. And my EconTalk hat, which is what I figuratively wear when I'm the host, is, and you can get an EconTalk hat, by the way. EconTalk swag is available, but it's not. I don't wear that hat when I'm podcasting. That EconTalk hat means when I'm the host, I've got to stay calm. And it took a while. You'll hear it in the early days with people I don't agree with. I get worked up. And it got to the point where I got less worked up and I got calmer, even when I was insulted, which fantastic skill to have. I'm very happy to have it. It's not the case that I can always remember I'm wearing my EconTalk hat because sometimes I'm not the host. I'm out in the world. Anyway, the last few years, they're less. I want to say one other thing. At some point, I realized that, the show, although listeners claim sometimes to want to hear me, they often would complain in the early days they want to hear the guest and more of the guest. And I'd say, fine, great. And I came to embrace that. I try to give the guest more time than I might want to naturally grab. And I saw my goal in those days and still today, that my job is to help you understand whether this book's worth reading. Is it valuable? My ideal is to try to have an interview that's better than the book. I can't always do that. Some books are fabulous, and I can't live up to that. And some guests don't speak as well as they write, so the interview is not as exciting as the book. But sometimes it's better, in my mind at least, which is very satisfying. But that's my goal, is to help you either learn the ideas that are in the book or the essay, and maybe decide whether you want to buy it or not. But you might decide, I got enough out of this, I don't need to read it, or that it's not worth reading in your view. That's fine. I always love it when people say, I didn't think I was going to like that episode, but it turned out it was really interesting. So I do hope you can trust me. I try to read books and interview guests I find interesting, and I hope if you're a listener that you will feel the same way. We'll see. Anyway, a lot of people say, which is, I can't tell you how gratifying it is, that my lack of combativeness in the face of disagreement is, they like that. You learn from that, and I find that I'm so appreciative that that's the case for you. I love it. That was not the goal of the program, but it is, I'd say, the most important thing that I've accomplished with the show, which is to give people a mode of disagreement that's respectful. And I've tried to get better at that over time. I don't know if I am, but there's virtually no editing of the program. We edit out coughs, sneezes. I sometimes lose my train of thought. I'm doing one of these interviews at the end of a very long day, and I have trouble keeping things on my mind, in my head. And I'll say, I lost my train of thought. I'll try to regather myself, and we edit that part out. But otherwise, it's pretty much just the conversation. One of the things that happened once, a guest had insulted her profession, her colleagues in general, not a particular person, but she said something negative about her discipline, and she called me or emailed me afterwards and said, can we cut that part out? And I said, maybe. Well, sure, if you want, but let's see how bad it was. So I went back and listened to it, and I didn't think it was bad. So I said, I'll tell you what, I'll let you listen to it. I'll send you the raw file, and if you don't like it, you can take it out. Once she heard it, she thought, yeah, it's fine. You're right. No big deal. It's just an interesting phenomenon that when you look back on an interview or a conversation, a lot of times you forget what actually happened, and you get anxiety about it. AI wanted to know if I use any AI tools in this for prep other than this episode, and the answer is I don't. But maybe that'll change going forward. I do like to read the book. I would not like to interview a guest where I used AI to read the book in advance and generate the questions. It could happen under stress or time pressure. But in general, I try to read the whole book, which I think is unusual. And of course, that affects what kind of guests I can have. I don't want to read a book a week. But there are years you can go look where I'll do 20, 30 books. I think most years I do 20, 30 books a year. I try to pick books that I'm interested in, I'm going to read anyway, ideally, or I want to read. But because of the time pressure of reading the book and that expectation I've set for myself, I try to mix in things with the books. And of course, some of those interviews are my favorites. They're probably yours, where I interview a practitioner about what their life's really like. We've interviewed people about how potato chips are made, how a Broadway show gets done, what it's like to run a hair salon, what it's like to be a car salesperson, what it's like to run a seafood restaurant chain. So I love those. I hope you like them too. I wouldn't mind doing more of them. They're fantastic. And obviously, they're less prep for me. I can talk to those people all day long. I don't have to read anything in advance. But in general, I try to read the book, if it's a book. And I try to read every word. But sometimes I lose interest in the book or I don't have time. And so what I do is I read it. The way I describe it is I read every page. I'll scan a page, make sure I see the key arguments that the author's making, because I don't want to misunderstand the point they're making or misinterpret something they're saying and then ask them a question that's messed up because it's not what they're saying at all. So I do try to read the whole book. But it's naturally the case sometimes that I realize, gee, this book looked a lot more interesting when I started it. And then I tend to skim a little bit in the middle there or toward the end. I don't choose guests that I don't respect. I only choose guests that I respect. So when sometimes you'll write me and say, why haven't you interviewed so-and-so? Or you should interview so-and-so. And by the way, if you ever want to find out if I've interviewed someone, a lot of times people will say, you should interview so-and-so. And I'll say, your wish is my command. And I'll send them the interview because I've already done it. And you just missed it or you didn't know how to look it up. We have an archive at econtalk.org. We have an archive at russroberts.info, which is my personal website. But the easiest way to find out if we've ever interviewed anyone, so if you want to know, did I ever interview Milton Friedman, you just put EconTalk Milton Friedman, and it pops up. It's always the first one. Or Ronald Coase, Milton Friedman. To my great delight, I was able to interview Ronald Coase, and he was the oldest guest I've ever interviewed. I think he was 102 or 104. I can't remember. But that's the easiest way to find out. But anyway, someone will suggest a guest I haven't interviewed, and they'll say, why don't you should interview so-and-so. And I'll think, well, it would be lively, but I don't respect so-and-so. So if I interviewed that person, it's going to be embarrassing. I'm not going to do a good job. It's not going to go well. So the bottom line, and sometimes I'm wrong, of course. I shouldn't respect someone, but most of the time, almost always, the people I've invited are not, they're people I respect. It's one of the reasons, though, I don't think I've ever broken this rule. I don't interview politicians because they're not interested in the truth. They're obviously selling. Of course, academics aren't always interested in the truth either. So it's hit or miss with them too. I was asked, could there be an episode 2000? It's unlikely. I'm 70 years old. I don't think I'll be doing this when I'm 87 or 90, but I'd like to do it for a while. I can't tell you how intellectually alive EconTalk keeps me. I have learned so many things and gotten so excited about so many things. Just a silly example. As you know, my granddaughter loves owls, and I thought, I should learn something about owls to keep her engaged with that. I realized I don't know anything about them, so what did I do? I found a book on owls, and I read it, and then I interviewed the author, Jennifer Ackerman. And that's a blast. That's incredibly fun. Or I don't know much about the pharmaceutical industry, and I interview a zillion people, and I get smarter. And I hope that works for you too, because that's definitely what I'm trying to do here. Okay, so next. As I said, once I feel like I've learned enough about something, I'll put it down. Right now, that's the case for AI, but So I'm not going to do another episode for a bit, probably. But on the other hand, it's changing so quickly, that'll change too. And it may be I do a bunch soon. Maybe it'll be different worries than I think people have that come to light. It's changing. So I'm going to spend more time with it and learn about it. And maybe something else, other issues will come up. Some topics are endlessly interesting to me, as you probably know. Epistemology, that is, how do we know what we know, is endlessly interesting to me. Healthcare, for example, what works and doesn't work. The complexity involved in the human body always fascinates me. And you can see some evolution in my thought as time passes on the issue of healthcare. I'm pretty free market on healthcare. That is, I think the current system in the United States, for example, is not very effective. It's very expensive. I think it's pretty high quality for the people who have good access to it, but not everybody has good access to it. And that means because it's highly subsidized, which is not a free market thing, those who don't have access through insurance or government programs pay an enormous premium. The only point I'll make there, as I've said many times on the program, out-of-pocket costs of that program out-of-pocket spending by healthcare consumers has fallen dramatically over time. And that means that when you're getting healthcare in America, you're not spending your own money. That pushes up your desire for healthcare. You're spending somebody else's money. And that has an important effect. So that'd be one example. But the other example I want to give, which I think is more about the challenges of avoiding bias. I used to be a defender of the pharmaceutical industry. I still am when appropriate. But, when we think about, say, price controls on pharmaceuticals or changing property rights around pharmaceuticals, I'd always say, well, if you do that, it's going to come at a big cost. You're going to have less innovation. And that's true, of course. But what I didn't understand, and I came to understand, for example, after listening to Robin Feldman's episode on pharmaceutical pricing, is the creativity of the pharmaceutical industry in playing with intellectual property laws to keep competition from generics at a minimum. So the monopoly power of a patented pharmaceutical gets extended beyond the letter of the law. Sometimes it's shorter than the letter of the law because of time it takes for approval and so on. So I do understand that. But my point is that, economists often have a knee-jerk reaction. Well, government intervention there is going to, if the healthcare system is not free market, not close to free market, the intellectual property rights around pharmaceuticals are incredibly complicated. And a lot of times economists have stylized stories to tell about those things that I think are overly simplified. And so that was a chance of growth. That was growth for me to appreciate that. What else did I want to say here? I think I made it clear. I'm not that interested in monetary economics anymore. I thought I understood it when I was younger, when I was trained at the University of Chicago. It was very powerful. And now I'm more skeptical of its reliability as a way of fully understanding everything. I think macroeconomics is really complicated. I've become much more of a Hayekian than a Friedmanian monetarist. When I say Hayeki, I mean in the Hayekian of the Nobel Prize address, The Pretense of Knowledge. The Pretense of Knowledge, fabulous essay, fabulous speech he gave when Hayek won the Nobel Prize. It basically expresses skepticism about our ability to have a full understanding or a useful understanding of the complex system called the macroeconomy. As you may know, I am increasingly interested in talking to creative people. I love my interviews with the photographer Jessica Todd Harper, Sabin Howard, the sculptor, the novelists and poets I've interviewed, Dwayne Betts, Dana Gioia, Immortals, and Mark Halperin. Those are exhilarating for me. They're fun for me. I was asked, have I ever listened to an episode, re-listened, and been surprised by what I said? As I mentioned before, it's a lot of times I'm not listening. So I do miss stuff because I'm thinking about other things to get the episode going. I wish I was better at putting guests at ease. It's quite a challenge over Zoom. A lot of people would assume that if I do something face-to-face, it's going to be more intimate and it'll be a better conversation. That's not true. Some people are very uncomfortable being in the room with a stranger for the first time and trying to be interviewed. So Zoom actually is good for some people, that distance that it provides. In my recent episode with Dwarkesh Patel, we talked about that. I think it's a real art to put people at ease. My favorite episodes, many of them are where I feel I've made a friend. That's a lot of that's been in recent years. In the early days, I loved EconTalk because I always learned something. I still do sometimes, obviously. But once I changed the tone and made it more of a conversation and less of a debate, I got better at connecting to the guests on a human level. And it's just special. I won't name names, but there are many, many guests I've had in the last, say, 10 years where I realized it'd be great to see them for a drink or socially if they ever came to Jerusalem or if I was ever in their city. These are very precious to me. There were a handful of episodes where once the recording stopped, we shared things that were personal that we didn't want to record that were really powerful. Those are really magical for me. Other guests, they're just friends in my mind. Maybe I'm a friend in their mind. We had a special connection. Maybe another time we'll reconnect in person. And I should just mention in passing that our relationship, mine with you, the listener, is, of course, very asymmetric. You've listened to me for thousands of hours. I may have received an email from you. So you know about my granddaughter, you know about my quirks, my parents, my weird habits about eating. I've shared all kinds of things over the years about that, but I know nothing about you. So I'm kind of your friend, but you're less my friend, which is just the nature of modern digital life. What else did I want to say here? I just say something about conversation rather than debate also. I like to think our brains are wired to hear conversation and learn from it. It's certainly true for most human history. That's all there was. There weren't any books. There was no reading. There was nothing else except people talking to each other. And there's no video. It wouldn't be surprising if our brains had an architecture that was designed to take in information and discover information through exploratory conversation or listening. So I love that. And so even though one of the deepest things I've ever learned is from Adam Mastriani, that the brain's not connected to the ears, and therefore what we hear in a lecture doesn't always go in, and sometimes we need experience to learn lessons. I like to think the conversation is different, and you listening to conversation is different. So than just being told something. So, for example, one of the nicest things you say to me sometimes as listeners is, "You asked the question I was going to ask." So that's cool, because what that means is that your brain is running alongside mine, and we're learning together from the guest and processing it in a similar way. At least I like to think so. Another big thing I learned from being the host, of course, which we've talked about before on the program, is when I realized that both sides of most ideological debates have lots of facts on their side and lots of studies. And that was the beginning of the fancy name is epistemological humility. That is, I'm not always confident that what I think is true. And along the way, I became highly skeptical of the power of econometrics, data analysis of the kind that economists and other social scientists do. You'll find that theme running back through the program starting, 2010 maybe, I'm not sure. But I realized that the people on my side, their facts and truths were maybe not true. They maybe weren't any more reliable. Their facts could be true, but the other side of facts also. And so you're stuck with logic and other ways. I've written a lot on this. Maybe we'll put up something about it. But I mean, it's a bit discouraging to think that you can't use data and statistics to prove things. I always add, it doesn't mean they're irrelevant. It doesn't mean data doesn't matter or facts don't matter. It's just that the ability to tease out, say, causation in a complex world is, I think, very challenging. And I think the replication crisis that we've had a couple episodes on is a good example of that. What are some of my favorite episodes that I remember vividly? Well, Christopher Hitchens would be one of them. Christopher Hitchens was visiting the Hoover Institution. I was there for the summer, and I realized he was in town and was at Hoover. And I got a hold of him, like, it was probably on a Wednesday, and I asked him if he'd like to do an EconTalk episode. I needed an episode for Monday. So he said yes. I said, let's talk about Orwell. And then I ran to a bookstore on University Ave. Forget the name of what it was right now. It might have been a Borders. They used to exist. And they had one book by Hitchens. They had his book on Orwell. And so we're going to interview, or the book's called, I think, Orwell Matters. So I asked Hitchens if that's what we could talk about, and he said, sure. So he said, come to my house. So he was staying at someone's house, and it was large and sprawling, and he told me to bring lunch. I got there around noon, and we sat out at the pool that was at the house, and we ate sandwiches, and I'm pretty sure we had a scotch, and I'm ashamed I don't remember what brand it was, but I'm sure there's some Hitchens fans out there who will know. But we had a scotch, we're out by the pool, and now I've got to interview him. And you'll go back and listen to it. Our audio quality wasn't as good in those days. This was obviously live and face-to-face. And we're recording this, and there were workmen working on the house, and they would constantly come into the living room where we were recording and interrupt us. I was there till, 3, 4 o'clock. I was there for hours. But it's one of my favorite interviews because the one question I was wise enough to ask him was if he saw himself as an Orwellian figure, a man who stood up for his principles and paid a price and lost friendship. Because Orwell famously, after the Spanish Civil War, soured on communism. And a lot of his communist friends hated him for that, and probably stopped talking to him. Maybe he had personal danger. And Hitchens had been a supporter of the war in Iraq, and he lost a lot of friends and supporters. So I asked him if he saw that as a parallel, and it's one of my favorite moments of the program. He said, absolutely not. We're nothing alike. What Orwell had to endure for what he said and stood up for is nothing compared to what Hitchens had to endure. So that was very moving to me, and you can listen to that in the interview. I have very powerful memories of interviewing Milton Friedman in 2006. I never had Milton for a class for credit. I had him for a non-credit class. My first year at Chicago was his last year before he went out to Stanford and the Hoover Institution. But I sat in on that class. Many of us first-year students did. We wanted to learn from him, and that class was only one thing. It was Milton standing in the front of the room and answering questions. Anything we asked him. We could ask him anything we want. We'd often ask him questions off the core exam, the exam that we'd be taking at the end of the year, to see if he could answer them, and he couldn't always, which was really great. It made us feel good. Anyway, Milton was always nice to me after that because it's a long story not worth going into, but the bottom line is I knew him beyond that. I had interacted with him about my first book, and he gave me a blurb for it. And once I started the podcast, I thought, boy, it'd be great to have Milton Friedman on EconTalk. So I showed up at his apartment in downtown San Francisco, gorgeous high floor overlooking the city with at least 2, if not 3, views in 2 or 3 different directions. It was absolutely magnificent. And we sat in his study, and I put a microphone on him and clipped on his lapel, and I had one on my lapel, and we talked for, I don't remember how long. We divided into 2 parts. One's on money, meaning the monetary history of the United States and his views on monetary policy and monetary economics. And the second was on his book, Capitalism and Freedom. And they're pretty good interviews. I talk way too much. I'm ashamed. I wish I'd talked less. But he was, I think, 94 at the time. I might be wrong about that, but he's old. And I remember standing in the doorway as I parted from him and just said thank you to him. And I realized I probably wouldn't see him again, and I did not. That was August of 2006, and he passed away shortly after that. But it was a thrill to be able to talk to him, a thrill to interview him. And yeah, my favorite moment in that interview, by the way, is when I asked him, I mentioned that a lot of the ideas in Capitalism and Freedom were still relevant, even though he'd written it in I think 1962, when it had come out in 1962. And he said something like, well, our ideas are timeless. They'll be true 10,000 years from now, or 1,000 years from now. I don't remember what he said, but the part I remember is that he said our, and I remember thinking, yeah, we're the same ideas, which we kind of do. But part of the money conversation that was insane is he was talking about the relationship between the money supply and nominal GDP. I think you could go look it up in the episode. And when I got home, I thought, was that really? I mean, how tight is that relationship? And I did some quick calculations, and I thought, they're not really very closely related. Maybe it was money and inflation. Maybe it was money and inflation. And I wrote Milton. I challenged him afterwards, and I said, I'm not sure this is. I know you made this point on the air, but they're not that well correlated. And he writes back and he says, no, you're looking at the wrong measure of money. I think I had used M2 or M1. He said it should be M3 or M4. I can't remember. And he sent me a spreadsheet and showed me that actually it was pretty correlated. And I got such a kick out of that this 90-plus-year-old man sent me a spreadsheet. What else? Let me say a little bit about uncertainty and certainty. Did an episode with Robert Burton on that, where he tells this incredible story of this guy who's so convinced of his own narrative and so certain about it that he believed that someone had come into his office and switched desks. And when the other person said, well, yeah, but the desk or the table has the exact same marks as the one that you had before, he said, that's what's so creepy about it. They reproduced the desk exactly and swapped out this new one. And it was an example of how hard it is to give up on your narratives and your the stories you feel. I have my own personal example that I want to share. I don't know if I've ever told this story, which is hard to believe since I think I've told every story I know on this program, but maybe not this one. Maybe I have. Anyway, one of my sons had a job, and it was the first day of work in the summer. And I told him, you got to get to work early. You've never been to this office before. You've never seen this person in face-to-face. You need to make sure you get there not just on time, but early. And I think he was supposed to get there at 9 o'clock. And it's 10 to 9, and he hasn't left yet. And I said, you're going to be late. He says, it's only an 8-minute ride. And I'm thinking, yeah, that only leaves you 2 minutes to find your ride. I'm really frustrated. And I was going right near there myself by car. And my wife drove me and dropped me off. And as I'm getting out of the car at 2 minutes to 9, 1 minute to 9, I see my son on his bike going in the exact opposite direction from the office I know he's supposed to be at. And he's clearly lost, and he's now going to definitely be late. And I see that, and I get out of the car, and I call his name at the top of my lungs to grab his attention and bring him back. And he totally ignores me, doesn't even turn to look at me. And I'm incredibly frustrated. He didn't take my advice to leave himself enough time. He's riding in the wrong direction, just like I told him. I said, you could get lost. And I've called his name and he hasn't even responded. And then to make it worse, as I see him flash by, and this is all happening within a second and a half, I'm really annoyed because he's wearing someone else's backpack. And that's because it's not him. My mind has filled in the blanks and I've told myself a story. So those kind of things, as I think interest me a lot, our ability to deceive ourselves. And then, related to these issues are the challenges we have in decision making, and the episode I did with Agnes Callard, and then the one I did with L.A. Paul, both with the Burton book and those of others, ended up leading to my most recent book, Wild Problems. And I'm so grateful for the way EconTalk lets me explore intellectual things, intellectual problems, questions, puzzles. And, it's what a wonderful thing that is. What else? Another thing I love learning is about intuition. I love the episode with Patrick House. Sometimes a single episode will change my way of thinking about something or the way I understand something. Patrick House says, talking about it, it comes out of his book, on consciousness. It's a great, great book. He says intuition is not in your gut, it's in your brain. And his claim is, I don't know if you remember the story, but it's a great story about the young officer or young person in the Army who's driving a fancy, high-ranking person in Iraq. I think it was Iraq. And he's driving along between two towns, and the road's a little bit dangerous. They both know that. And all of a sudden, the driver slams on the brakes, turns around, and goes back to the base they started at. They're halfway. It's crazy, or part way. And the big shot says, "What are you doing?" He says, "Well, I just don't have a good feeling." And the other guy's thinking, "Well, what kind of thing is it to not have a good feeling? That's enough for you to try? That's your intuition? You have a bad feeling? Sounds like just paranoia." And they get back to the base, and a couple hours later, the guy again asks the driver, "Do you think you have a better idea of why you turned around?" And he says, "Yeah, I don't, but I have an idea of partly maybe kind of why, which is when I think back on it, there were no kids playing on the road that day. And maybe my brain processed that fact and said, if the kids aren't playing on the road, maybe the moms know something about there's some danger here. So they told their kids to stay inside. But I didn't think about that consciously. His brain just said something's wrong." That fascinated me. I'm intrigued by this idea of intuition. I'm intrigued by this idea of how our experiences, houses ideas at the back of our brain is processing things without our conscious knowledge. And it's an amazing thing. I think it's true. But I'm very interested in that whole idea of how we come to understand things, how we come to, the Adam Mastriani point about the brain not being connected to the ears. It's had a deep effect on me on how I think about education and how experience gets us to think about things. Similarly, another thing I've learned from the program is how certain deep concepts can be described and even defined, but not absorbed. We had I think it's the interview with William Byers on mathematics, and he makes the observation that there's certain concepts like randomness, and I would add emergent order or others, they have profound depth. We can define them, we can describe them, but that doesn't mean you understand them just because you can hear the description. So where wisdom comes from is really interesting to me. The role of education in producing wisdom as opposed to information is deeply interesting to me, and I think about these things a lot, certainly in the context of college. I'm a big believer, as you might know, in the power of incentives, and I used to believe very strongly in the power of incentives to improve education. I think they can. I think vouchers and other forms of competition which produce those incentives would make American education better. But my interview with Elizabeth Green about her book was sobering. I realized there's cultural reasons that schools don't perform well or that students struggle to learn. And that book changed my thinking. And again, it's not that I don't think incentives matter, but I came to realize that things were a little more complicated. A related point is when I do an episode on EconTalk with someone who has a viewpoint or an axe to grind or a conclusion, I do try to look for things that are on the other side. And I want to test my own beliefs on that, and I want you to have a chance to hear the other side. But I don't automatically do that if I don't think the other side has some chance of being true. I don't think you have to always have both sides of them. So I don't arbitrarily choose somebody for the other side. I try to find someone from each side that I respect or whose views I respect. It's not like, they need a platform too. I had one side, I'll have the other. I try to challenge each side politely so that you can understand the strengths and weaknesses of the argument. The question is, what's one takeaway about humility, incentives, and culture you'll hope listeners will carry into their own life? And all three matter. I hope listeners have come to understand the power of humility, the power of incentives, but also the importance of culture. So they all have some worth thinking about. Let us out this part. So Chat GPT asked me a great question. What are the 3 episodes that I would recommend to give listeners the flavor of EconTalk? So I thought that's a hard question, and I thought I'd turn around and give it to you listeners, and I'll give you 5. What are the 5 episodes you'd list to give people the flavor of the program or to help a friend understand what makes this worth listening to? Tell us. You can send me an email, put it in the comments to the episode because I'd love to hear what you think. What's amazing is when we do our survey at the end of the year, and I ask for your favorite episodes. Every single episode, all 52 or 53 or 51, depending how many Mondays there are in the year, always gets a vote. And it's crazy, right? The top 5 are a lot of people who like all 5 of those, but many, 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 many other people don't agree. You pick a different top 5. Last question from Chat GPT. If every single episode was suddenly wiped from the internet tomorrow and you had 5 minutes to record a single seed message for future listeners, what core idea or ethos would you preserve and why that above everything else you've explored over almost 20 years? I don't think that's an answerable question because the brain is not connected to the ears. So no 5 minutes would make magic. There's no 5 minutes I could record where you'd go, wow, those are deep truths. I'm going to live by those. That's why you can't learn the lessons of Homer's Odyssey by reading the comic book version or the Chat GPT summary. You've got to explore. You've got to struggle. You got to grapple with it. And those of you who've been on this journey at my side, I assume you too have gone through some transformation, or at least I like to think so. And I've tried to share some of that in this conversation. It's not a conversation, well, it is with me and you. But, the Twitter version or X version of what we're doing here can't be done. The transformation that I've gone through came from the experience of reading and listening to my guests for over 1,000 hours. And for those of you who've gone on that journey with me, to the extent you've been paying attention, and the things we talked about were relevant for your life and your way of thinking, I hope you've had some changes too. And as the poet says, that has made all the difference. ChatGPT asked me, what toast would I make to my audience if we were together and had a glass of champagne to hoist? Or maybe even better, a shot of Ardbeg or Lagavulin. I'd say to you, stay curious and be lovely. I could ask for nothing more for myself or for you who are listening. And now for some thank yous, some gratitude that I owe. First to you, my listeners, what a long, strange, unexpected trip this has been. Thanks for joining me for the ride. It's been a wonderful experience. It's not over. There may even be some changes going forward to make it better. What an extraordinary opportunity I've had, and how this opportunity has been enriched by sharing these conversations with you, the audience. Knowing that you're listening makes these conversations that much more gratifying. Your emails give me great satisfaction to know that I've touched or taught you in any way. I'm grateful to all the guests, something over 600, who've given me your time and enthusiasm and presence. how special that has been. I mentioned the influence of my interviews with Agnes Callard and L.A. Paul on my book, Wild Problems. I should have mentioned the names of their books that I read and that inspired me along with the interviews. Agnes Callard's book is Aspiration, and L.A. Paul's is Transformative Experience. They're great books. I should also mention the crazy 6-part bonus episodes I did with Dan Klein on Adam Smith's book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, which I almost certainly wouldn't have read without Dan's eagerness to discuss it on EconTalk. And of course, that inspired me to write my own book, How Adam Smith Can Change Your Life. I want to single out a few frequent guests: Mike Munger, Don Boudreau, Arnold Kling, and Tyler Cowen. They've all been guests on EconTalk at least 15 times. I've learned so much economics from all of you. And Mike, you bailed me out so many times when a guest canceled and I'd ask if you had something interesting to talk about, and you always did. You always have something interesting to talk about, something you've read or you're writing. Mike has been a guest 49 times. That's really close to 5% of all the episodes, a little over twice a year. Incredible. I'm grateful to Yasuhiro Tsuchiya, whose song Cleared Up Sunset is our theme music. I'm grateful to Liberty Fund for sponsoring EconTalk. Liberty Fund was founded by Indianapolis businessman Pierre Goodrich, a big believer in serious conversations about great books. So even though he died in 1973, I like to think EconTalk is very much in accordance with donor intent. I want to thank Emilio Pacheco and Amy Willis from Liberty Fund for endlessly championing and supporting EconTalk and helping to make it what it is today. I'm grateful to the Hoover Institution and Shalem College for supporting me and making EconTalk possible. I couldn't do this without a lot of practical help. Lauren Landsberg has been a friend and stalwart contributor to so many aspects of the podcast from the very beginning. She always aspires to excellence, and that in turn has inspired me. She makes sure every episode's released on time, error-free, and more than that, she's been a crucial intellectual partner and friend in much that I've done at the Library of Economics and Liberty, but especially in developing and sustaining this podcast. My sound engineer, Rich Goyette of iCast Audio, has been devoted to constantly improving the sound quality over the years and has done a superb job, as well as being incredibly reliable. I'm grateful to Marla Goldfinger and Katie Flavin, who every week do a great and thorough job creating the content for the webpage for each episode at econtalk.org. And thank you to my friend Les Cook, the producer of EconTalk. He does his job superbly and has bailed me out many times with remarkably quick turnaround and always with his consummate professionalism. Thank you all. What a privilege it has been to host this program for so long. I hope to keep it going in the future. Thank you, thank you, thank you. This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.